it's a heavy book and a lovely book. I'm very grateful to have spent the time reading it that you prompted me into. And in part, among my credits, I guess, is this thing that usually only journalists and financial analysts have, which is an all-Asia designation. Asia is big enough to be unwieldy, and more than big enough, it's actually conceptually dense and loose to an extent that, as you point out, has made it a relatively rare topic for histories. Your history concentrates on the 20th century, I would say, before and after the Great War, the Second World War in the middle. And it's an extremely interesting one. I mean, the way that you marshal facts together, for the most part uncontroversial facts, it creates a series of perspectives that I found to be really startling. Before I lay out some of that stuff, I might start from the end of the book where a lot of your conclusions reach their most unusual proportions. I'd like to ask what inspired you to bring together Asia, to make Asia a thing, where so often nowadays people see it as China or the Indian world or its parts.
Yeah, well, I've lived and worked in Asia, in East Asia, for about 25 years now, and spent about 4 or 5 years at University of Pennsylvania, working on Asia as well, and then worked in Philadelphia on the Asian economy. So that was the beginning, but really the story began with trying to understand why it is that the parts of Asia that were ruled by Japan are the most prosperous. So if you look at the parts of Asia that Japan ruled, Korea, Taiwan, and remarkably, the only industrialized parts of China are the parts that Japan ruled. In fact, everything that is industrialized and developed in China, apart from some of the recent areas like Chongqing, were ruled by Japan. And that is what got me started, to try to understand why it is. And the parts of Asia that were ruled by Britain the longest are the poorest. So you look at the parts of India that are poorest, and Eastern India, Bangladesh, they were ruled by Britain the longest, and so they're the poorest. So that's what got me started. And I quickly discovered that at the point of independence, India's literacy rate was 14%. When Iraq got independence from Britain 11 years later, Iraq's literacy rate was that magic number of 14% as well. And on the other hand, Korea and Taiwan were at 60% at the same time. And life expectancy was much higher, in fact, dramatically higher. 55 years in Taiwan, 32 years in India. I mean, the undivided India. And 32 years was the worst of any country on earth at that point. African average was 38. So why was that? And this is what led me to look into this. And then as I looked into it more and more, I felt it was even more important to have an Asian perspective on Asian history. Because recently, I don't know if you heard, Mahathir, just before the election in Malaysia, insulted Najib by calling him a Bugis pirate. And it's quite fascinating that...
Those are the villains in Lord Jim.
Yeah. Now, you see, the point is, I've met many Buginese over the years, and they always apologize, first of all, by saying, oh, we used to be pirates. I say to them, no, you weren't pirates. You guys were great mariners and seafarers. The pirates were the Dutch and the English. Similarly, there's a great admiral of the Maratha fleet called Kanhoji Angre. Most Indians haven't heard the name. If you're not from Maharashtra, you probably don't know Kanhoji Angre. Kanhoji Angre was a tremendous admiral who sank the British naval fleet in 1721. But in all the histories, in the British histories, he's referred to as a notorious pirate. The pirates were the Brits. So if you turn the lens, you come to very different conclusions, and then you begin to see things from an Asian perspective. And so, unfortunately, the Japanese are painted as villains by people in East Asia, particularly by the Chinese. But to my mind, what is striking is the parts that Japan ruled turned out to be much more prosperous. The approach to economic development that Japan has has essentially been emulated first by Korea, then by Taiwan, then in effect by China with some variations, Singapore with some variations. And I think there's a lot for India, for instance, to learn from that experience as well.
So great. That confirms some of my suspicions about the original thinking that goes into the book. And now I want to share, in a way that's not quite a spoiler, I want to share with the audience some of the conclusions that you draw. So an interesting thing about this way of looking at Asia that pays special attention to Japan and India as maybe the trailblazer and the laggard in terms of 20th century development is that it gives less attention, although still copious attention, to China. Often if someone's trying to define Asia, they'll define it in reference to China, whereas your description of ancient Asia tends to begin more with India. And when we're looking at economies today, of course, China steals all of the headlines.
Yeah.
This is a problem we have as a journalist. When you want to run an Asia section, everyone asks too much about China. So let me skip ahead to a couple of, one is sort of an historical hypothetical, and the other looks quite a lot like a prediction for the future. From the epilogue then, you say that Japan's key wartime legacy was to have liberated East Asia from European dominion by May 1942. Indeed, and this in parentheses, had Russia won the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-05, Korea and Manchuria would immediately have come under Russian rule, and Asia would most likely have continued to be European-controlled to this day, akin to Francophone Africa or pre-1991 Soviet Central Asia. That's a very startling view of the present.
That's right. So quickly to address that, chapter 2 of the book looks at the impact of the Russo-Japanese War. And it was really important. Now, if you just think about it, had Russia won that war, most of our Korean friends would be called Kimsky or Parkov. As
Karimov and so
Karimov
on in Central Asia.
Nazarbayev and Aliyev, the founder of modern Azerbaijan was called Gedar Aliyev. Actually, his name is Haidar Ali. Mm-hmm. But anyway, so we would have had Kimovs and Parkskys and so on. But the point is that made a huge difference to almost everybody in Asia. In fact, it was because of the Japanese victory that Bengal was partitioned in October 1905. It was to ensure that the Indians didn't get too uppity about thinking along nationalist lines, that Curzon partitioned Bengal. Now, today we don't think of Bengal as very important because it's one of the minor states of India. But
said by a Bengali.
But it is. Anyway, it's a backwater. If you go to, Bangalore airport is 3 times the size of Calcutta. Anyway, now the point is that in 1905, Bengal encompassed what is now Bangladesh, West Bengal, Bihar, Orissa, and Assam. And it was two-third Hindu, one-third Muslim. So the partition of Bengal was aimed at stemming the tide of nationalism that was spreading from Japan to the rest of Asia. And I have to say that the British succeeded. They succeeded in ensuring that the partition of Bengal in 1905 led to the partition of India in 1947. There was absolutely no certainty of that happening even until March of 1947.
Something else that struck me, you described partition and indeed the decades of enmity between India and Pakistan since as if, I'm not sure if you're making fully this claim, but as if it was an intentional consequence not only of British colonizers but also of America's post-war strategists and other Western forces generally. Do you think the two are?
Not at all. I actually make the point that the Americans, FDR in particular, worked very hard to keep India united. In fact, FDR particularly was was absolutely determined that India would not be partitioned. Truman, somewhat less so, because he wasn't as aware of everything, but he sent a couple of envoys to try and ensure that it wouldn't happen. The partition of India, ironically, of course, was part of British grand strategy. There's no doubt. There was a white paper I talk about, published in May 1945, that talks about how Britain needed to hold on to India, what needed to be done to hold on to India until 1960. But that white paper also mentioned that if they were ever to have to leave, then they must ensure, the British must ensure, that they have a hold on Baluchistan and NWFP. Ironically, NWFP had voted Congress to power in both 1937 and 1946. So it wasn't going to be that easy to get NWFP to be part of, to be outside India. But it happened. It happened because of Nehru's awful mistakes, one after the other. Anyway, it's a long story.
Yeah.
That's all mentioned in the book. And then, of course, the other aspect is that the partition, the first shock that the Americans got was that the Congress on the 8th of March 1947 declared that they wanted the partition of Punjab. Until that point, nobody in Congress had ever countenanced the idea of partition of anything. But Congress proposed the partition of Punjab on the 8th of March 1947 after the government of Punjab had been toppled. And just as an aside, it's interesting to remember that the partition violence was concentrated in one province alone, Punjab. There was very little violence in 1947 in Bengal, in Sindh, NWFP, Baluchistan. All the violence was concentrated in one province, Punjab. Punjab did not have an elected government from the 1st of March 1947 onwards. There was a British governor who was in charge. And so it's not an accident that all the violence during partition happened in the one state that did not have an elected government. Surawardi, the chief minister of Bengal, was quite dastardly the previous year. About 5,000 people got killed in the Great Calcutta killings. But that pales into insignificance compared to what happened in 1947. Yeah. And in 1947, as chief minister of Bengal, he ensured that the peace was maintained in Bengal. So the British engineered partition. They not only engineered partition, they engineered the violence in Punjab to create permanent facts on the ground that would ensure that there would be enmity between Hindus and Muslims forever afterwards. That was the idea. But I think Nehru cannot escape blame either. I don't blame him too much in the book. I blame mainly Jenkins, the governor. But the Prime Minister of undivided India was Jawaharlal Nehru. And it is astonishing that nobody blamed him. He was in charge of the police as well.
Uh-huh.
The police, the army should have all come out. Didn't.
So some of these themes, in particular, some of the axes, various axes you have to grind against the Nehru dynasty, bring me around to another kind of interesting tension in the book. I mean, I do think you resolve it, but it's interesting to see. On the one hand, you take fully to account decades of planned economy in India under the original socialist model of the New Republic, and blame it quite squarely. I mean, a lot of it directed at policies of autarky designed to protect and build industries such as were unable to grow under the British. And that's more than anything else, I think, the villain of the story of India's 20th century. Now, Japan's being the hero is kind of interesting because, of course, theirs is also a highly planned economy. The MITI model that led the way for the Asian tigers is in sharp contrast to the free trade consensus that became the neoliberal standard by the end of the 20th century. So you teach the lessons of Japan and India not as a case for or against planned economies or protected industries, state champions. The distinctions you draw are quite different than those.
Yeah. Yes, the distinctions are quite different. Now, let's start with this. In the 1930s, two economies did really well in the world. One was Japan. From 1931 to 1936, Japan was led by a man called Takahashi Korekiyo, who was one of my heroes. He's called the Keynes of Japan. And he was assassinated 2 months before Keynes' book, Great Treatise, was published. Keynes' treatise was published in April 1936, 2 months after Takahashi was assassinated. But during those 5 years, 31 to 36, Takahashi demonstrated how capitalism could survive a Great Depression using policies that are now called Keynesian. In a fairer world, Keynes would be called the Takahashi of the world, or of the West perhaps, because the policies were initiated.
Did Keynes study Japan?
I don't think he studied in too much detail, no. But to some degree, the New Deal in America was also a form of it, but the New Deal came 2 years after Takahashi had already got going and made substantial progress. So the one country that defeated the Great Depression in the capitalist world, the only one, was Japan. If you read Nehru's Glimpses of World History, there's 1.5 paragraphs on Japan, and he more or less dismisses it. He spends 2 chapters on Stalin and his second 5-year plan.
But is that
now?
You said 2 countries.
The other country is Stalin. Stalin's Russia. Stalin's Russia did well in the 1930s. There's no doubt about that as well. Except that he killed about 5 million people along the way. Takahashi didn't need to kill anyone. In fact, he got killed himself. So there's a vast difference. Now, the difference in the approaches to planning are the following. The problem with what Nehru was trying to do was that it was autarkic. It basically closed off almost the entire economy from imports, especially imports of consumer goods were entirely banned. Imports of almost everything else was banned as well. So it was a very, very extensive system of protection. There was protection in Japan as well, but it was limited not only in terms of the number of sectors involved, it was limited by the duration of protection. It was clear that protection was not going to be permanent, it would be removed over time. So there was an imperative for industries to become competitive with global players. And of course, within Japan, if you look at, for instance, the car market, there were 6 to 7 Japanese competitors inside Japan as well. If you look at the way India did the planning during the Nehru years, there were essentially 2 car makers. And they were kept protected for 40 years. So if you're protected for 40 years, there's no imperative to try and become competitive, to compete with imports ever. And the problem really is that India kept the protections in place for too long. They were much wider. And the intellectual provenance for the ideas were coming from Stalin rather than from Takahashi. Now, it's interesting that in 1938, Subhash Bose was president of Congress, and he formed a planning committee as well. The planning committee was very akin to the Niti Aayog that we have in India today. The planning committee was set up to try and provide ideas for the states, which were all run by the Congress at that time, to industrialize. And I think the approach that Subhash Bose was proposing would have been much more appropriate to India at that time. It would have been much more appropriate to India at any time, in fact, and it would have been much more akin to the Japanese way, which was eventually emulated by the Koreans and the Taiwanese as well. And they succeeded. Now, the interesting thing about Japan, Korea, Taiwan is that not only did they succeed with industrialization, they are even today the most egalitarian societies in Asia in terms of, if you look at Gini coefficients, they are the most equal in terms of income distribution, in terms of wealth distribution, much more so than China. China has an extremely unequal
More
society.
so than any country, as it happens, that has the word socialist in the name of its official
Absolutely.
republic.
Yeah.
I'm just thinking ahead. We have only a half-hour session here. I would like to leave at least 5 minutes at the end for a couple of brief questions. Sure. I've got one more bigger question that I'm still puzzling through about. And again, the contrast. I should advise readers. The book really does range across the continent. There's quite a bit of time for Caucasian states in the Arabian Peninsula as well as Asia proper. But the Japan-India comparisons and lessons keep coming back to me. And I wonder, among the enormous contrasts to be drawn, Japan has, it's often said, a natural basis for an ethnic state. It's got a degree of homogeneity, as does Korea, some other places, that those republics that inherited their territory from old-fashioned empires, and that could be true of India, of China, other states in the region too, lack, quite naturally. Now, at points you mention some of the disfiguring effects of European colonialism, for instance, partition, or there's an aside about Sri Lanka and how religious conversions in schools there created demographic differences within a population. But then there are the bigger countries, of course, have enormous differences among their peoples that are ancient. Now, I wonder what kind of advantage or disadvantage the European model of an ethnic nation state has for the Asian states that followed, and then I wonder in part because there are ongoing efforts to create ethno-nation states in this region where they don't yet exist.
Well, first of all, if you look at the history of India, China, or Indonesia, the three great civilizational states in Asia, all three have existed as civilizational states through at least 2,000 years. And the point is that having lived in Asia, the rest of Asia, the influence of India on Asia is so pervasive. And the influence works both ways. The influence of the rest of Asia on India is also there very much. So, for instance, the king of Thailand is called Ram. Mm-hmm. He's called King Rama the 10th. Indonesians, the founder of Indonesia has a name from the Mahabharata. His name is Sukarno. Actually, it's Karn is a figure in the Mahabharata who is an ambiguous figure. You're not quite sure whether Karn is good or bad. He's generally quite bad. So you can't name a guy Karn alone. So he's called Su-Karn, which is good Karn. He's the good side of Karn. And that's and similarly, across all of Asia, you have the pervasive influence of India's culture. I think one of the reasons I wrote a book about the whole of Asia is that Asia is the part of the world where plurality in religious belief is an essential aspect of Asia's way of life. So the best one I heard was a tourist guide in Japan telling me that we Japanese are born as we are born as Shintos, we get married as Christians, and we die as Buddhists. Uh-huh. And that is, that form of pluralism is central to Asian life, wherever you look at it. And that is, now there is a binding factor in India. I don't think it takes much doing to understand what that binding factor is. You can call it culture, you can call it religion, but there is a binding historical memory of unity that even Shashi Tharoor writes about in his book about Hinduism. Shankaracharya, about 1,000 years ago, saw the unity of India. He left 4 dhams in 4 different parts of the country, which basically described India's unity. So I don't think that the question of India's civilizational unity is something that is at all questionable. And similarly with China. I mean, China too, we don't realize it sitting here, but out of the last 1700 years, China has been ruled by a Chinese dynasty before the communist one for just 260 years. The rest of the 1700 years, China was ruled by various dynasties of foreign provenance.
Going back to the Yuan and Qing.
Yuan Qing in particular. So the point is that these periods of foreign rule have perhaps reduced the memory of unity, but I don't think they've eliminated them. Similarly, if you look at Indonesia, they had Srivijaya, you had Mataram. These were all civilizational states that bound people of different linguistic communities together into a single state that lasted thousands of years, or at least hundreds of years, and that outlasted the end of one dynasty. So, Churchill wanted to say that India is no more than the equator, no more one than the equator, is just a geographical identity. But that, I point out that Churchill was wrong on 99% of what he said and did, and this is another one of them.
Thank you. I mean, you've provoked even more questions in my mind than before. But with our couple of minutes left, let's see if we are able to take a question or two from the audience. Is that right? Just one? 2 questions, please. One there.
We started a bit late, though. We started about 2 minutes late.
Well, they're very, very
Give us 4 more
punctilious about the time.
Yeah.
A question for the man in the tie-dye, please.
Hello.
Because you talked about a few things, including the lack of elected government in Punjab, whereas there was no other violence elsewhere. Maybe you are glossing over the Noakhali killings, etc., etc.
It happened earlier. See, Noakhali killings happened in October 1946, and the killings that happened there were reprisal killings. First, of course, was the great Calcutta killings of 16th August 1946 as a result of Direct Action Day. But Direct Action Day was a result of the silly press conference that Jawaharlal Nehru gave in July 1946, where he basically repudiated the Cabinet Mission Plan. The Cabinet Mission Plan was a plan that could have held India together. Both the Congress and the Muslim League had agreed to it. And he turned it down. So that led to Direct Action Day. Direct Action Day, if there was anyone to blame, it was H.S. Surawardi, no question about it. And then there were reprisal killings in Bihar in October 1946, succeeded by the Noakhali, further reprisals in Noakhali in eastern Bengal.
May I
so
draw
that did happen. So, but that is 1946. I'm talking about 1947. August 1947, Partition Riots. The partition violence was concentrated entirely in Punjab. Okay.
PK, let me draw a line under danger to ask an author of a history about details.
It was not a granular question. I don't want to argue details with you. You'll have your facts. And what I wanted to say was, even if you look at Burma, you look at Laos and Cambodia, so there were other poorer parts of Asia. So I'm just questioning the basic premise that the parts that Japan occupied and ruled for a certain amount of time were all prosperous.
Yeah. I can vouch for the fact that he addresses those particular exceptions.
I very much do, and particularly Burma. Burma, the sad thing about Burma, in fact, is that Burma was ruled by Japan for 3 years. It was not, actually. It was given independence by Japan on the 1st of August 1943. Barmore was the elected leader of Burma. He had won the election by a landslide in 1932 and in 1937. So he was given the prime ministership. He deserved to be. Aung San was his deputy and defense minister. But the point is, the sad aspect of Burma's story is that Burma fell back into British control at the end. And Britain ensured the assassination of Aung San and his cabinet. It was as if Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Adams had all been killed in one day. That's basically what happened to Burma in July 1947. The entire cabinet was assassinated 6 weeks after a rainbow coalition cabinet had been formed by Aung San. So that was British divide and rule taken to its extreme, in fact.
Yeah.
So that's the answer to that.
Burma is a good demonstration of the point. Can I take? I saw you gave us a slight reprieve. Can I take one more question? Terrific. We'll let that be it. Thank you. Yes.
Hello. Yeah. Prasenjit.
Yes.
Over here. Yeah. I just wanted to ask you, what was this partition of India? Was it not to create two buffer states, Pakistan in between Afghanistan and India, by the British, and around August 45, when Japan came into being till Kohima almost, then Bangladesh was also again formed as a buffer state between any farther in the future kind of a Japanese invasion into India. These were not two buffer states for that which the partition happened, basically. I understand your 1904...
Can I answer that question?
Yeah. So
quickly answer that?
Yeah.
As a tail to this question is that in 1904, the Russo-Japanese War ended with the... and during that time, 1905 was when we kind of know that the Great Game also came to an end with the capture of Tibet, right, with Young Husband. So, is like...
I'm sorry, can I just take the first question in there? Our time is well past
Quickly.
up.
Okay.
The buffer state theory?
Okay, quickly. The simple reason for partition was that Britain owned all the oil in Iran and all the oil in Iraq. So they needed to keep Baluchistan and NWFP in order to ensure that they had control over the oil in Iran and Iraq. Now, the importance of this was demonstrated during the Second World War. In the Second World War, both Iran and Iraq had elected or legitimate leaders who wanted to stay neutral. There was a guy called Rashid Ali al-Gailani, who was the elected Prime Minister of Iraq. The British Indian Army was used to invade Iraq in August 1941, commanded by Wavell. He invaded Iraq to oust Rashid Ali from government, from prime ministership, and install a British puppet. Then there was an Anglo-Soviet invasion of Iran, again led by Wavell and Auchinleck, with Indian troops, because in the southwestern part of Iran is where all the oil is, and the oil was owned by one company, today called BP, then known as Anglo-Persian Oil Company. So they owned all the oil. So in order to keep control, there was a joint Anglo-Soviet invasion, and Reza Shah, who was a remarkable modernizer, he was competing with Ataturk to modernize Iran. He was ousted and replaced by his feckless son, the last Shah, Muhammad Reza Shah Pahlavi. And then, of course, you had Mossadegh, who actually nationalized APOC and was ousted in a CIA coup.
But
so it was after that that the CIA became the bad guys. As far in my book, the CIA, I mean, the Americans weren't bad guys until what
Nixon.
they did to Mossadegh.
Oh, until Mossadegh. Okay.